Dr. Adrian Foster leaned forward, peering through the frost-coated window of the helicopter. Below, the Alaskan wilderness sprawled out, a vast expanse of white broken only by jagged peaks and dark, frozen rivers. The rotors thumped steadily, a constant reminder of how far they were from civilization. The pilot, a grizzled man named Hank, glanced over his shoulder. "Almost there, Doc. You sure you want to be out here?" Adrian nodded, his face set with determination. "I've been out to worse places. This won't be the first time." The outpost came into view, a cluster of metal buildings huddled together against the cold. Smoke rose from a single chimney, the only sign of life. As they descended, Adrian's breath fogged the glass, blurring the stark landscape. He wiped it away with his sleeve, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature outside. The helicopter touched down, and the door swung open, letting in a blast of frigid air. Adrian grabbed his duffel bag and stepped out onto the packed snow. His boots crunched with every step as he made his way to the main building. He felt eyes watching him from the narrow windows, a sense of unease creeping in despite the bright daylight. Inside, the warmth was a welcome relief. He pulled off his gloves, flexing his fingers to get the blood flowing again. A tall man with a stern face and gray hair approached him. "Dr. Foster, I'm Captain Reynolds. Welcome to Outpost 31. "Thanks. I got the brief on the way. This SCP-009. It's like nothing we've seen before." Reynolds nodded, his expression grim. "It's dangerous. The red ice isn't like anything in the natural world. It spreads fast and it's aggressive." Adrian frowned. "Aggressive? I shouldn't be aggressive." "You'll see what I mean soon enough. Follow me." They walked down a narrow hallway, the walls lined with steel and lit by flickering fluorescent lights. The place had a cold, clinical feel to it, a stark contrast to the wildness outside. They stopped in front of a heavy door with a warning sign plastered on it, "Biohazard authorized personnel only." Reynolds punched in a code, and the door hissed open. The room beyond was filled with lab equipment and a few anxious-looking scientists. In the center, under harsh lights, was a containment unit. Inside, a chunk of red ice glowed ominously. Adrian stepped closer, his curiosity piqued despite the uneasy feeling in his gut. The ice seemed to pulse, almost as if it were alive. He reached out, then stopped himself, remembering the warning. "Don't touch it," Reynolds said sharply. "It's already claimed 3 lives. 1 drop of water, and it starts spreading. It converts everything it touches." Adrian nodded, his mind racing with possibilities and dangers. "I'll need full access to all your data, and I want to start tests immediately." "Of course. But be careful, Dr. Foster. This thing, it's like it's waiting for a chance to break free." Adrian glanced at the red ice again, feeling its malevolent presence. "I'll be careful. We can't afford not to be." As he began setting up his equipment, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong here. The red ice was more than a scientific anomaly, it was a threat, and it was up to him to figure out how to stop it before it was too late. The outpost's main building was a maze of narrow hallways and small, cramped rooms. Adrian followed Captain Reynolds through the dimly lit corridors, the smell of antiseptic heavy in the air. The place felt more like a bunker than a research facility. They stopped at a door labeled conference room. Reynolds pushed it open, and Adrian stepped inside. The room was filled with a handful of scientists and military personnel, their faces a mix of fatigue and tension. They looked up as Adrian entered, their expressions a blend of hope and skepticism. "Everyone, this is Dr. Adrian Foster," Reynolds announced. "He's here to help us understand and contain SCP-009. A young woman with short, dark hair stood up and extended her hand. "Dr. Foster, I'm Dr. Emily Hayes. We spoke briefly over the comms. It's good to finally meet you in person." Adrian shook her hand, noting the firmness of her grip. "Good to meet you too, Dr. Hayes. I understand you've been leading the research here." Hayes nodded. "Yes, though it's been challenging. SCP-009 isn't like anything we've encountered before. The red ice is highly unstable and incredibly dangerous." Adrian glanced around the room. "I need to know everything you've observed. Even the smallest detail could be crucial." The team spent the next hour briefing Adrian on their findings. They described how SCP-009 had been discovered, the strange occurrences that had followed, and the initial containment efforts. As they spoke, Adrian took detailed notes, his mind working through the possibilities. "The red ice seems almost alive," Hayes said, her voice tinged with frustration. "It spreads rapidly when it comes into contact with water and converts anything it touches into more red ice. We've lost several containment units already." Adrian frowned. "And what about the psychological effects? I've heard reports of strange behavior among the team." A man in a military uniform, Major Daniels, cleared his throat. "Some of the personnel have been experiencing nightmares, hallucinations. It's like the ice is affecting their minds." Adrian's eyes narrowed. "That's concerning. We'll need to monitor everyone closely. No one should be alone, and any unusual behavior needs to be reported immediately." Reynolds nodded. "Agreed. We've already set up a rotation schedule to make sure there's always someone on watch." Hayes handed Adrian a tablet. "Here's all the data we've collected so far. I suggest you start with the initial containment logs. They provide a good overview of how SCP-009 behaves." Adrian took the tablet and scanned through the information. The data was extensive, but the patterns were erratic. It was clear that the red ice wasn't just a simple chemical anomaly. There was something more to it, something they hadn't yet understood. "I'll need access to the lab and the containment unit," Adrian said, looking up. "And I want to run some tests of my own. We need to figure out how to stop this before it spreads any further." Reynolds nodded. "You'll have full access. But remember, Dr. Foster, we've already lost good people to this thing. Be careful." Adrian met Reynolds' gaze, the weight of responsibility settling heavily on his shoulders. "I will. We're all in this together." As the meeting broke up, Adrian headed to the lab, his mind racing with possibilities. The unease he'd felt since arriving was growing stronger, but he pushed it aside. There was no room for fear now. They had a job to do, and failure wasn't an option. In the lab, he set up his equipment and began reviewing the data in detail. The more he read, the more questions he had. The red ice defied all known scientific principles. It was as if it were from another world, something beyond human understanding. Hours passed, and the cold light of the Alaskan day began to fade. Adrian barely noticed his focus entirely on the mystery before him. He knew the coming days would be critical. They were facing an enemy unlike any other, and they had to find a way to fight back. As he worked, the sense of unease lingered, a constant reminder that they were dealing with something far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. The containment unit stood in the center of the lab, a glass cylinder filled with the ominous glow of SCP-009. Adrian stood before it, his hand steady despite the unsettling sight. The red ice pulsed faintly, as if it had a heartbeat of its own. "Ready to begin?" Dr. Hayes asked, standing beside him. Adrian nodded. "Let's do this, carefully." They'd set up a series of tests to understand SCP-009 better. Adrian adjusted the controls, initiating the first experiment. A small vial of water was slowly introduced into the containment unit. The reaction was immediate. Tendrils of red ice shot out, converting the water into more of itself. The transformation was quick and violent, the ice growing with an eerie, almost predatory speed. "Did you see that?" Hayes whispered, her voice tight with awe and fear. "Yeah," Adrian replied, his eyes fixed on the containment unit. "It's like it's alive." He noted the readings on the monitor. Temperature fluctuations, energy spikes, nothing made sense. The ice didn't just freeze, it assimilated. He moved to the next test, introducing a piece of organic material. The red ice responded just as aggressively, consuming it within seconds. "This stuff is relentless," Hayes said, shaking her head. "How do we stop it?" Adrian didn't answer immediately. He was deep in thought, analyzing the data, looking for any weakness. "We need to understand what drives it. It's not just reacting to water, it's reacting to life." They continued their tests, each one revealing more about SCP-009's nature. The red ice was not just a physical threat, it seemed to have an almost intelligent hunger. It spread with purpose, adapting to every attempt to contain it. Adrian glanced at the team. They were watching him, waiting for answers he wasn't sure he could provide. The weight of their expectations was heavy. "We'll find a way," he said, more to himself than to them. "We have to." Hours passed as they worked. The lab was filled with the hum of machines and the occasional gasp of surprise or frustration. Each test brought them closer to understanding SCP-009, but also closer to the realization of how dangerous it truly was. Adrian finally stepped back, rubbing his eyes. "That's enough for now. We need to analyze this data thoroughly." Hayes nodded. "Agreed. But what's our next step?" "We focus on containment first," Adrian said. "No more direct tests until we've got a better idea of how to neutralize it." They gathered around a table, poring over the data. The room was silent, except for the clicking of keys and the rustling of paper. Outside, the wind howled, a constant reminder of their isolation. Adrian felt a chill run down his spine. It wasn't just the cold. There was something deeply unsettling about SCP-009. It wasn't just a scientific anomaly, it was a threat, a predator waiting to break free. "Adrian," Hayes said softly, breaking into his thoughts, "do you think this thing is sentient?" He looked at her, considering the question. "I don't know, but it's behaving like it has a purpose. We need to find out what that purpose is." They worked late into the night, the red glow of SCP-009 casting long shadows across the lab. As the hours dragged on, the sense of unease grew. Adrian couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something crucial, something that could mean the difference between life and death. Finally, he stood up, stretching his tired muscles. "Let's call it a night. We need rest if we're going to figure this out." The team nodded, gathering their notes and heading to their quarters. Adrian lingered for a moment, staring at the containment unit. The red ice pulsed softly, a silent threat. He turned off the lights and left the lab, his mind still racing with unanswered questions. As he walked down the dark hallway, the sense of dread followed him, a constant reminder of the danger they faced. SCP-009 was more than just an anomaly. It was a warning, and Adrian was determined to uncover its secrets before it was too late. The next morning, the lab was buzzing with cautious energy. Adrian had barely slept, his mind consumed with possibilities and strategies. Dr. Hayes and the rest of the team were already there, prepping for another round of experiments. "Morning," Hayes said, handing Adrian a cup of coffee. "We've set up the next series of tests. Ready when you are." Adrian took a sip, savoring the warmth. "Let's get started." They began with controlled samples, testing SCP-009's reaction to different substances. The red ice responded aggressively to almost everything, its growth patterns erratic but always purposeful. Each test confirmed the same terrifying truth: SCP-009 was relentless. "Look at this," Hayes said, pointing to a screen. "It's reacting to the electromagnetic fields. It's like it's sensing them." Adrian leaned in, studying the data. "Interesting. Maybe we can use that to our advantage. They continued their tests, introducing various materials and fields. The red icy's responses were unpredictable but revealing. It seemed to be searching for something, an underlying intelligence guiding its actions. Let's try increasing the temperature, Adrian suggested. Maybe we can slow it down. They introduced a heat source, carefully monitoring SCP-009's reaction. The red ice recoiled slightly, its growth slowing but not stopping. It was a small victory, but it gave them hope. Temperature could be a key factor, Hayes said. If we can sustain higher temperatures, we might be able to contain it more effectively. Adrian nodded. Agreed. Let's set up a series of tests at different temperatures. We need to find the threshold. As they worked, the mood in the lab shifted. The initial fear was giving way to a cautious optimism. They were making progress, each test bringing them closer to understanding SCP-009. But the red ice was not their only concern. The psychological effects were becoming more apparent. Team members were reporting vivid nightmares, feelings of paranoia, and unexplained aggression. Adrian, Major Daniel said, approaching him with a grim expression. We've had another incident. One of the researchers, Dr. Lin, attacked a colleague. She's been isolated, but she's not making any sense. Adrian felt a chill. I need to see her. They headed to the medical bay, where Dr. Lin was restrained on a bed, her eyes wild with fear. She was muttering to herself, her words incoherent. Dr. Lin, Adrian said gently. Can you hear me? Her eyes snapped to his, filled with terror. The ice. It's in my head. It's everywhere. We can't escape it. Adrian exchanged a worried look with Hayes. We need to monitor everyone closely. If the ice is affecting our minds, we're in more danger than we thought. They returned to the lab, the sense of urgency renewed. The red ice was more than just a physical threat, it was an existential one. They had to find a way to stop it before it consumed them all. As the day wore on, they focused on containment strategies. They tested various barriers and materials, looking for anything that could hold SCP-009 at bay. Progress was slow, but each small success was a step forward. By evening, exhaustion was setting in. Adrian rubbed his eyes, staring at the data. We're getting there, he said, more to himself than anyone else. We just need to keep pushing. Hayes put a hand on his shoulder. We'll figure it out. We have to. They wrapped up the experiments for the day, securing the lab and double-checking the containment unit. The red ice pulsed softly, a constant reminder of the danger they faced. As Adrian headed to his quarters, he couldn't shake the feeling of unease. They were making progress, but the threat of SCP-009 loomed large. The psychological effects were a wild card one they hadn't accounted for. Lying in bed, Adrian stared at the ceiling, his mind racing. The red ice was more than just a scientific puzzle, it was a battle for their survival, and he was determined to win. Sleep came fitfully, filled with dark dreams of spreading ice and whispering voices. The red ice was in his head now, a constant presence he couldn't escape. But he pushed the fear aside. They had a job to do, and failure was not an option. The lab was a hive of activity as Adrian and the team prepared for another day of experiments. They had new protocols in place, focusing on the red icy's reactions to varying conditions. Adrian was cautiously optimistic they were making progress, albeit slowly. Dr. Hayes handed him a clipboard. We're set to test the heat thresholds again. If we can determine the exact temperature that slows SCP-009, we might have a containment strategy. Adrian nodded, checking the setup. Good. Let's start with a controlled increase. The team gathered around the containment unit, watching as the temperature inside was slowly raised. The red ice pulsed and writhed, its movements becoming more sluggish as the heat increased. For a moment, it seemed like they were on the right track. But then, something went wrong. An alarm blared, and the lights flickered. Adrian's heart sank. What's happening? Hayes frantically checked the monitors. The containment unit is malfunctioning. We're losing control of the temperature. Before they could react, the glass of the containment unit cracked. A loud hiss filled the room as the red ice surged, escaping its confines. Panic erupted as the team scrambled to contain the breach. "Shut it down," Adrian shouted. "We need to contain it now." Technicians rushed to isolate the affected area, but the red ice moved too quickly. It spread across the floor, converting everything it touched. The room descended into chaos as people tried to avoid contact with the malevolent substance. One of the researchers, Dr. Kwon, slipped in his haste, his hand landing in a puddle of the red ice. He screamed in agony as the ice spread up his arm, crystallizing his flesh in seconds. The sight was horrifying, and Adrian felt a surge of helplessness. "Get him out of here," Major Daniels barked, pulling Kwon away from the spreading ice. "We need medical assistance now." Adrian watched in horror as Kwon's screams echoed through the lab. The ice continued to spread, and it was clear that their containment efforts were failing. The team was being overwhelmed, and the red ice showed no signs of stopping. "We need to evacuate the lab," Adrian said urgently. "We can't stop it here." Reynolds nodded, his face grim. "Everyone, move. We're evacuating." The team retreated, leaving the lab to the advancing red ice. They sealed the doors behind them, but Adrian knew it was only a temporary measure. The ice would continue to spread, seeking out new sources of water and organic material to convert. In the hallway, the team regrouped, their faces pale with shock and fear. Dr. Kwon was rushed to the medical bay, but Adrian knew there was little hope for him. The red ice's effects were irreversible. "We need to reassess our containment strategies," Adrian said, trying to keep his voice steady. "This thing is more dangerous than we anticipated." Hayes looked shaken. "We've never seen it spread so fast. It's like it knew what we were trying to do." Adrian nodded. "It's learning. We need to stay ahead of it." They spent the next few hours in an emergency meeting, planning their next steps. The lab was off limits, and they had to figure out how to contain the red ice before it breached other areas of the facility. "We need to isolate the water supply," Major Daniels said. "If it can't find water, it can't spread." Adrian agreed. "And we need to reinforce our containment units. No more glass. We need something stronger." The mood was tense, the air heavy with fear and determination. They were facing a relentless enemy, and they had to find a way to stop it before it consumed them all. As the meeting ended, Adrian felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. The first incident had been a harsh reminder of the red ice's power. They couldn't afford any more mistakes. Back in his quarters, Adrian stared at the data from the day's experiments. The red ice was more than just a scientific anomaly, it was a living, adapting threat, and it was up to them to find a way to contain it before it was too late. Sleep eluded him that night, his mind replaying the chaos in the lab. The red ice was in his thoughts, a constant presence he couldn't escape. But he knew they had to keep fighting. Failure was not an option. The next morning, Adrian woke to the sound of the outpost's alarm. The stark red lights flashed ominously through the narrow corridors, signaling the lockdown. The containment breach had escalated the situation to a full quarantine. No one was going in or out. Adrian pulled on his jacket and hurried to the control room. The tension was palpable. The team was already there, gathered around the main console. Captain Reynolds stood at the center, his face set in grim determination. "We've lost contact with the lab," Reynolds said, not looking up from the screen. "The red ice is spreading. We need to seal off that section completely." Adrian nodded, feeling the weight of the situation. "What's the status of Dr. Kwon?" Dr. Hayes stepped forward, her eyes tired. "He's stable, but barely. The red ice spread too far before we could isolate it. It's like it's feeding off him." The words hung in the air, a reminder of the stakes they faced. Adrian took a deep breath, trying to clear his mind. "We need to regroup. Our priority is containment. We can't let it spread any further." Reynolds nodded. "I've ordered all non-essential personnel to stay in their quarters. Only essential staff are to move around the facility, and always in pairs." Isolation settled over the outpost like a heavy blanket. The hallways, once bustling with activity, were now eerily silent. The team moved with caution, the sense of trust eroding with each passing hour. Everyone was on edge, the fear palpable. Adrian spent most of the day in the control room, reviewing data and planning their next steps. The Red Icy's behavior was unpredictable. It spread relentless. They needed to find a way to halt its advance, but every attempt seemed to provoke it further. Dr. Hayes approached him, her face etched with worry. "Adrian, the psychological effects are getting worse. People are reporting more vivid nightmares and hallucinations. We need to address this before it spirals out of control." Adrian nodded, rubbing his temples. "I know. We need to find the source of these effects. It's got to be connected to the ice." They set up monitoring stations, keeping a close watch on everyone's mental state. The isolation was taking its toll, the Red Icy's influence creeping into their minds. The team was fraying at the edges, the pressure mounting. That evening, Adrian found himself alone in the mess hall, staring at a cup of coffee he didn't really want. The silence was oppressive, the usual camaraderie replaced by a tense solitude. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something crucial, something that could turn the tide. The door creaked open, and Major Daniels walked in, his expression grim. "Mind if I join you?" Adrian shook his head. "Please. I could use the company." Daniel sat down, his eyes scanning the room as if searching for unseen threats. "We're doing everything we can, but this thing, it's like it's alive. It's playing with us." Adrian sighed. "I know. We need to stay focused. Panic won't help us." Daniels nodded. "Agreed. But the team is scared. We need a win, something to show them we can fight back." Adrian looked at his cup, the black coffee reflecting his own tired face. "We'll find a way. We have to." The hours dragged on, the isolation deepening the sense of dread. The team continued their work, but the atmosphere was charged with fear and mistrust. Everyone was a potential threat, every shadow a possible danger. Late that night, as Adrian reviewed the latest data, an alert flashed on his screen. The red ice had breached another section of the facility. He felt a cold knot of fear tighten in his chest. He rushed to the control room, where Hayes and Reynolds were already coordinating the response. "We need to contain it. Now," Adrian shouted. They worked frantically, sealing off sections and rerouting power. The red ice was relentless, it spread seemingly unstoppable. The sense of isolation grew, the outpost feeling more like a prison with each passing moment. As the team fought to contain the breach, Adrian couldn't shake the feeling that the red ice was toying with them, testing their limits. They were in a battle of wills, and the enemy was far more cunning than they had ever imagined. By the time they managed to seal the latest breach, exhaustion had set in. The team was frayed, their nerves raw. Adrian knew they couldn't keep this up much longer. They needed a breakthrough, something to tip the balance in their favor. As he lay in his bunk that night, the oppressive silence of the outpost pressing down on him, Adrian resolved to find a way to defeat the red ice. They were running out of time, and the isolation was slowly driving them to the brink. But he couldn't give up. They had to fight, even if it felt like they were already losing. The days at the outpost blurred together. a relentless grind against the omnipresent threat of the red ice. Adrian's sleep was plagued by nightmares, dark visions of spreading crimson that gnawed at his sanity. He wasn't alone. The entire team seemed haunted, their eyes shadowed with fatigue and fear. Morning, Dr. Hayes greeted him wearily as he entered the control room. "You look like you got about as much sleep as I did." Adrian managed a tired smile. "Nightmares." She nodded. "Every time I close my eyes, it's like the ice is in my head." They weren't the only ones. Reports of disturbing dreams, hallucinations, and paranoia were increasing. Adrian knew they had to address it, or the psychological toll would break them before the ice did. "All right, everyone," Adrian called the team together. "We need to talk about what's happening to us. The red ice isn't just a physical threat. It's messing with our minds." Major Daniels crossed his arms, his expression stern. "We need a plan, Doc. People are on edge. We can't afford a breakdown." Adrian nodded. "Agreed. We need to document everything. Dreams, hallucinations, any strange behavior. We need to understand how the ice is affecting us mentally." Dr. Hayes set up a log for everyone to record their experiences. As the team filled in their entries, the scale of the problem became clear. Vivid nightmares of being consumed by ice, whispers in the dark, the feeling of being watched. Everyone was experiencing it. "It's like the ice is alive," one of the researchers said, his voice trembling, "like it's trying to get inside our heads." Adrian couldn't dismiss the possibility. The red ice seemed to have an intelligence, a malevolent will. They had to stay vigilant, support each other, and find a way to counteract its effects. That evening, Adrian sat with Major Daniels in the mess hall. The usually lively room was quiet, the atmosphere heavy with unspoken fears. "How are you holding up?" Adrian asked. Daniels shrugged. "I've seen combat, Doc. This is different. It's like fighting an enemy you can't see." Adrian nodded. "We need to keep our heads clear. The ice feeds on fear and chaos. We can't give it that." Daniels looked at him, a flicker of hope in his eyes. "What's the plan?" "We need to keep documenting everything. Find patterns, weaknesses. And we need to keep morale up. If we fall apart, the ice wins." Daniels nodded. "I'll make sure everyone stays on task. We'll get through this." As the days passed, the team continued their work, but the psychological effects were taking their toll. Dr. Lynn's condition worsened, her eyes filled with a vacant, haunted look. Adrian felt a pang of guilt every time he saw her. They were running out of time. One night, Adrian was jolted awake by a noise outside his quarters. He grabbed a flashlight and cautiously opened the door. The hallway was empty, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. He forced himself to breathe, to stay calm. He wasn't alone for long. Dr. Hayes appeared, her face pale. "Did you hear that?" Adrian nodded. "Let's check it out." They moved through the dimly lit corridors, their footsteps echoing in the silence. The source of the noise was the control room. They found Major Daniels there, staring at the monitors, his face set in a grim mask. "What's going on?" Adrian asked. Daniels pointed to the screens. "Look at this." The security footage showed shadows moving through the facility, shapes that shouldn't be there. Adrian's heart raced. "Is it the ice?" "I don't know," Daniels replied. "But it's affecting the cameras. We need to be careful." The sense of dread deepened. The red ice was playing with them, eroding their sanity bit by bit. Adrian knew they had to find a solution, and fast. The next day, they intensified their research, focusing on the psychological effects. Dr. Hayes suggested using a Faraday cage to see if blocking electromagnetic fields could reduce the influence of the red ice. It was a long shot, but they were desperate. They set up the cage and monitored their sleep inside it. The results were promising. The nightmares were less intense. The sense of paranoia diminished. It wasn't a cure, but it was a start. "We need more of these," Adrian said. "If we can protect our minds, we stand a better chance." As they worked on building more Faraday cages, the team's spirits lifted slightly. It was a small victory, but it gave them hope. That night, as Adrian lay inside the protective cage, he felt a glimmer of optimism. They were fighting back, reclaiming their minds. The red ice was a formidable enemy, but they weren't defeated yet. Sleep came easier, the whispers quieter. They had found a way to shield themselves, to hold on to their sanity. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep them going. The battle was far from over, but Adrian knew they had taken a crucial step forward. The next morning, the atmosphere in the outpost was tense but slightly more hopeful. The Faraday cages had provided some relief from the psychological effects, but the red ice remained an ever-present threat. Adrian knew they needed more than just a temporary solution. They needed a breakthrough. Dr. Hayes and Adrian were in the control room, going over the latest data. The Faraday cages were helping, but the red ice continued to spread, adapting to every containment method they tried. It was relentless. "We need to find a way to neutralize it," Adrian said, frustration creeping into his voice. "The cages are a good start, but they won't stop the ice." Hayes nodded. "Agreed. But what else can we do? Every experiment has just made it stronger." Before Adrian could respond, the alarm blared, echoing through the facility. He felt a chill run down his spine. Another breach. They raced to the source of the alarm, arriving at the medical bay. Dr. Lin was lying on the floor, her body covered in red ice. Her eyes were open, staring blankly at the ceiling. The sight was horrifying. "No," Dr. Hayes shouted, rushing to Lin's side. She was stable. "How did this happen?" Adrian knelt beside Lin, checking for any signs of life. There were none. The ice had consumed her completely. He felt a surge of helplessness and anger. They had failed to protect her. Major Daniels arrived, his face grim. "We need to secure this area. Make sure the ice doesn't spread further." Adrian nodded, standing up. "We have to learn from this. Figure out what went wrong and make sure it doesn't happen again." The team worked quickly to contain the red ice in the medical bay. They sealed the doors and set up additional barriers, hoping to prevent further breaches. The mood was somber, the loss of Dr. Lin a stark reminder of the danger they faced. Back in the control room, Adrian and Hayes reviewed the footage from the medical bay. They watched in horror as the red ice seemed to pulse and grow, moving with a disturbing sense of purpose. "It's like it knew she was weak," Hayes said, her voice barely a whisper. "It's targeting us." Adrian clenched his fists. "We need to stay strong. We can't let it pick us off one by one." The team gathered for a meeting, their faces reflecting the fear and uncertainty that had settled over the outpost. Adrian took a deep breath, trying to project confidence despite his own doubts. "We lost Dr. Lin today," he began, his voice steady. "But we can't let her death be in vain. We need to use what we've learned to fight back." Major Daniels spoke up. "We need to reinforce our defenses. Make sure the Faraday cages are operational and expand their use." Adrian agreed. "We also need to focus on finding a way to neutralize the ice. There has to be something we're missing." The team spent the next few hours brainstorming and conducting tests. They introduced various chemicals and compounds to the red ice, hoping to find something that would halt its spread. The results were disappointing, but they couldn't afford to give up. Late that night, Adrian sat alone in the lab, staring at the containment unit. The red ice pulsed softly, a silent reminder of their predicament. He felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him, the faces of his team members flashing through his mind. A noise behind him made him jump. He turned to see Dr. Hayes, her face drawn with exhaustion. "You should get some rest," she said gently. "You're no good to us if you're burnt out." Adrian nodded, but he knew sleep would be elusive. "I'll try, but we need to keep pushing. We're running out of time." Hayes put a hand on his shoulder. "We'll find a way. Together." As Adrian made his way to his quarters, he couldn't shake the image of Dr. Lynn's lifeless eyes. The red ice was a formidable enemy, but they had to believe they could beat it. Failure wasn't an option. Lying in his bunk, Adrian stared at the ceiling, his mind racing with plans and possibilities. They had suffered their first death, but it wouldn't be the last if they didn't find a solution. The battle was far from over, and the red ice was relentless. But so were they. The days following Dr. Lynn's death were the darkest the outpost had seen. Morale was low, and the creeping dread of the red ice was palpable. Adrian knew they needed a new approach, something bold and risky, or they would all perish. Dr. Hayes and Adrian met early in the control room, both looking worn but resolute. "We can't keep going like this," Hayes said. "We need a game changer." Adrian nodded. "I've been thinking about something. It's dangerous, but it might work. We've been reacting to the red ice. Maybe it's time we go on the offensive." Hayes looked intrigued but wary. "What do you have in mind?" Adrian outlined his plan. "We need to create a controlled explosion. Something powerful enough to destroy the ice at its core, but contained enough not to bring the entire outpost down." Hayes frowned. "That's risky, Adrian. We're talking about using explosives inside the facility. If it goes wrong..." "I know," Adrian said, his voice firm. "But we're out of options. We need to try something drastic. The red ice is relentless, and it's learning. We have to hit it hard and fast." They presented the plan to the rest of the team. Major Daniels listened intently, then nodded. "It's a gamble, but I agree. We need to take the fight to the ice." The team spent the next day preparing. They gathered explosives from the supply cache, rigging them with precise timers. They chose a section of the outpost where the red ice was most concentrated, hoping to target its core. As they worked, the tension was thick. Everyone knew the risks. One wrong move, and they could all be buried under ice and rubble. But desperation fueled their determination. "Ready?" Adrian asked, looking at his team. Faces grim, they nodded. They moved through the dimly lit corridors, the cold metal walls closing in around them. Adrian could feel the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. This had to work. They reached the designated area, the red ice pulsing malevolently in the dim light. Adrian set the charges, his hands steady despite the fear gnawing at his insides. He finished, then stepped back, giving the team a final look. "Everyone clear?" he asked. Hayes and Daniels gave the thumbs up. "Clear," they echoed. Adrian activated the timer, and they retreated to a safe distance. The seconds ticked by slowly, each one a drumbeat in the silence. Adrian's heart pounded in his chest. The explosion rocked the outpost, a deafening roar followed by a shockwave that rattled the walls. The ground trembled, and for a moment it felt like the entire structure would collapse. Adrian held his breath, waiting for the dust to settle. When it did, the sight before them was both terrifying and hopeful. The blast had shattered the red ice, pieces of it scattered across the floor. Some parts still pulsed weakly, but the core had been hit hard. "We did it," Hayes breathed, her voice filled with a mix of relief and disbelief. Adrian nodded, but he knew it wasn't over. "We need to move quickly. Destroy the remaining pieces before they can regenerate." The team sprang into action, using portable flamethrowers and chemical agents to obliterate the remnants of the red ice. It was grueling work, but inch by inch they made progress. Hours later they stood amidst the wreckage, exhausted but triumphant. The core of the red ice was gone, and the remaining fragments were being systematically destroyed. It wasn't a total victory, but it was a significant blow. Adrian looked at his team, seeing the spark of hope reignite in their eyes. "We're not done yet," he said, his voice firm. "But this is a start. We can beat this." As they returned to the control room, the outpost felt different. The fear was still there, but now it was tempered with a sense of determination. They had faced the red ice and struck back. It was a small victory, but it was enough to keep them going. That night, Adrian allowed himself a few hours of sleep, the first restful sleep he'd had in days. The battle was far from over, but they had proven they could fight back. They had a chance, and that was all they needed. As he drifted off, Adrian knew the next steps would be just as challenging, but they had momentum now. The red ice was a formidable enemy, but they were learning how to fight it. They had taken the first step toward reclaiming their outpost, and that made all the difference. The brief victory was short-lived. The team had hoped that their drastic measures would slow the red ice significantly, but within days it became clear that the enemy was far from defeated. The ice adapted, spreading in new and unpredictable ways. The atmosphere in the outpost grew more tense and desperate with each passing hour. Adrian stood in the control room, staring at the monitors. The red ice was pulsing again, creeping through the vents and along the walls. They had contained one threat, only for another to emerge. "We need a new plan," he said, frustration evident in his voice. The explosion slowed it down, but it's not enough. Dr. Hayes looked equally worn. "What about isolating it completely? We could try to starve it out." Adrian shook his head. "We've tried cutting off its resources. It's like the ice is finding new ways to sustain itself." Major Daniels entered the room, his face grim. "We've lost another section. The living quarters are compromised. We need to act fast or we'll be overrun." The team gathered again, their expressions reflecting the mounting pressure. Adrian felt the weight of their expectations, knowing that another failure could be disastrous. "We need to go bigger," Adrian said finally. "We need to create a barrier that the ice can't penetrate, something it can't adapt to." Hayes nodded slowly. "We could try using a different kind of energy field, something more intense than the Faraday cages." Daniels frowned. "That's risky. We don't know how the ice will react to stronger fields." "We don't have a choice," Adrian replied. "If we don't stop it now, we're done for." They set to work, gathering materials and setting up the equipment. The plan was to create a powerful electromagnetic barrier around the most critical areas of the outpost. It was a long shot, but it was their best hope. Hours turned into a blur as they worked, the constant hum of machinery and the occasional burst of sparks filling the air. The tension was palpable, everyone acutely aware of what was at stake. Finally, they were ready. The team stood in the main control room, fingers crossed as Adrian initiated the barrier. The lights flickered as the new field powered up, a low hum resonating through the outpost. For a moment it seemed to be working. The red ice slowed, its advance halted by the invisible wall of energy. "It's working," Hayes whispered, hope lighting up her face. But the relief was short-lived. The ice began to pulse more aggressively, its color deepening to a darker, more ominous shade of red. It was as if the barrier had provoked it, pushing it to adapt even faster. "Look," Daniels shouted, pointing to the monitors. The red ice was moving again, faster and more erratically. It surged against the barrier, testing for weaknesses. The hum of the machinery grew louder, and then, with a deafening crack, the field overloaded. The lights went out, plunging the outpost into darkness. Alarms blared and panic set in as the team scrambled to restore power. "Backup generators." "Now," Adrian shouted, fumbling for his flashlight. Emergency lights flickered on, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The team worked frantically, but it was clear that the barrier had failed. The red ice was spreading unchecked, its pace accelerating. "We need to evacuate," Hayes yelled over the din. "We can't contain it." Adrian knew she was right. They had no choice but to abandon their positions and fall back to the safer areas of the outpost. He led the way, guiding his team through the dimly lit corridors, the red ice nipping at their heels. They regrouped in the central hub, the one area still holding against the ice. The mood was grim, the sense of failure heavy in the air. "We've bought ourselves some time," Adrian said, trying to sound hopeful. "We need to come up with a new plan." Daniel shook his head. "We're running out of time and options. If we don't find a way to stop this thing soon, we're all dead." Hayes looked at Adrian, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and determination. "We can't give up. There has to be something we haven't tried." Adrian nodded, though he felt the weight of doubt pressing down on him. They had tried so much, and each time the red ice had adapted, becoming more dangerous. But he couldn't let that stop them. "We'll find a way," he said firmly. "We have to." The team set to work once more, their resolve hardened by the latest failure. The red ice was relentless, but so were they. Adrian knew the next attempt had to succeed, or it would be their last. The central hub of the outpost was now their last sanctuary. Adrian and the team were running on fumes, each failure taking a heavier toll. They needed answers, and they needed them fast. Dr. Hayes was hunched over a stack of reports, her eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. "Adrian, take a look at this," she said, her voice tinged with urgency. Adrian walked over, his curiosity piqued. Hayes spread out a series of documents and photographs on the table. "These are from the initial discovery of SCP-009. I think we've been missing something critical." Adrian scanned the documents. They detailed the discovery of the red ice in a remote Alaskan cave. The photographs showed strange symbols carved into the cave walls, symbols that seemed eerily familiar. "These symbols," Adrian said, tracing them with his finger. "They look like something I've seen before. Ancient script, maybe." Hayes nodded. "Exactly. I've cross-referenced them with ancient texts. They're a match for symbols used in early alchemical practices, linked to transformation and control." Adrian's mind raced. "You're saying the red ice might not be just a natural phenomenon? It could be something created, something ancient." "Yes," Hayes replied. "And if that's true, there might be a way to reverse, or at least stop its effects." They dove into the research, searching for any clues about the origins and potential weaknesses of the red ice. Hours passed, but their persistence paid off. Hidden among the texts was a reference to a substance that could counteract transformations caused by alchemical processes. "Here it is," Adrian said, pointing to a passage. "An ancient compound used to neutralize alchemical reactions. If we can synthesize this, it might stop the red ice." Hayes looked hopeful. "We have some of the components in the lab. It's a long shot, but it's worth trying." They gathered the necessary materials and set up a makeshift lab in the central hub. The process was delicate, each step crucial. The rest of the team watched anxiously, the weight of their survival resting on this experiment. As they worked, Adrian couldn't shake the feeling that they were close to something big. The symbols, the ancient texts, it all pointed to a purpose behind the red ice, something beyond mere chance. Finally, after hours of careful preparation, they had the compound ready. It was a clear, viscous liquid, stored in a small vial. "Let's test it," Adrian said, holding the vial up to the light. "But we need to be careful, if this goes wrong." Hayes nodded. "We'll proceed with caution. We have one shot at this." They moved to a small, controlled area where a sample of the red ice was contained. Adrian carefully applied a drop of the compound to the ice. At first, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the red ice began to recede, the dark crimson fading to a dull gray. "It's working," Hayes whispered, her eyes wide with amazement. The team watched in awe as the red ice continued to dissolve, retreating from the compound. It was their first real victory, a glimmer of hope in the darkness. "We need to scale this up," Adrian said, his voice filled with new energy. "We can neutralize the red ice if we can produce enough of this compound." They worked through the night, synthesizing as much of the compound as they could. The mood in the outpost shifted, the despair giving way to cautious optimism. As they prepared to deploy the compound on a larger scale, Adrian couldn't help but think about the origins of the red ice. There were still so many questions. Who had created it, and why? But for now, they had a chance to fight back, to reclaim their outpost. The battle was far from over, but they had found a weapon, a way to push back against the relentless ice. "Let's do this," Adrian said, holding up a vial of the compound. "For Dr. Lin and for all of us." The team nodded, their resolve strengthened. They moved with purpose, ready to face the red ice once more. This time they had hope. This time they had a chance. The newfound hope brought by the compound was short-lived. As Adrian and the team prepared to deploy it on a larger scale, tensions within the outpost reached a boiling point. Fear and paranoia were taking their toll. Adrian stood in the control room, directing the preparation of the compound. Dr. Hayes and Major Daniels were by his side, coordinating the efforts. The rest of the team worked tirelessly, the sense of urgency palpable. But not everyone was on board. A group of researchers, led by Dr. Sullivan, gathered in a corner, their faces etched with distrust. They had been growing increasingly vocal about their doubts and fears, questioning Adrian's leadership and the risks they were taking. "We need to talk," Dr. Sullivan said, stepping forward. "This plan is too dangerous. We've already lost too many people. We should be focusing on evacuation, not some last-ditch effort to fight this thing." Adrian turned to face him, trying to keep his voice calm. "Evacuation isn't an option. The ice is spreading too fast. If we don't stop it here, it will follow us wherever we go." Sullivan shook his head. "We're scientists, not soldiers. This isn't our fight." Major Daniels stepped in, his voice stern. "It is our fight, Dr. Sullivan. If we don't stop the ice, there won't be anywhere safe left to go. We need to stand together." The room grew tense, the divide between the two factions widening. Adrian could see the fear in Sullivan's eyes, but he also saw something else: determination. This wasn't just about fear, it was about control. "We've already made progress," Adrian said, trying to appeal to reason. "The compound works. We have a chance to stop this." Sullivan crossed his arms. "A chance isn't good enough. We're risking everything on a theory. I won't be part of this suicide mission." Before Adrian could respond, the alarm blared, signaling another breach. The red ice was advancing again, creeping closer to their sanctuary. "This is it," Major Daniels said, grabbing his gear. "We need to deploy the compound now." Adrian nodded, turning back to Sullivan. "We don't have time for this. Help us, or get out of the way." Sullivan hesitated, then turned to his group. "We're not staying here to die. Anyone who wants to come with us, now's the time." But not everyone was on board. A group of researchers, led by Dr. Sullivan, gathered in a corner, their faces etched with distrust. They had been growing increasingly vocal about their doubts and fears, questioning Adrian's leadership and the risks they were taking. "We need to talk," Dr. Sullivan said, stepping forward. "This plan is too dangerous. We've already lost too many people. We should be focusing on evacuation, not some last-ditch effort to fight this thing." Adrian turned to face him, trying to keep his voice calm. "Evacuation isn't an option. The ice is spreading too fast. If we don't stop it here, it will follow us wherever we go." Sullivan shook his head. "We're scientists, not soldiers. This isn't our fight." Major Daniels stepped in, his voice stern. "It is our fight, Dr. Sullivan. If we don't stop the ice, there won't be anywhere safe left to go. We need to stand together." The room grew tense, the divide between the two factions widening. Adrian could see the fear in Sullivan's eyes, but he also saw something else: determination. This wasn't just about fear, it was about control. "We've already made progress," Adrian said, trying to appeal to reason. "The compound works. We have a chance to stop this." Sullivan crossed his arms. "A chance isn't good enough. We're risking everything on a theory. I won't be part of this suicide mission." Before Adrian could respond, the alarm blared, signaling another breach. The red ice was advancing again, creeping closer to their sanctuary. "This is it," Major Daniels said, grabbing his gear. "We need to deploy the compound now." Adrian nodded, turning back to Sullivan. "We don't have time for this. Help us or get out of the way." Sullivan hesitated, then turned to his group. "We're not staying here to die. Anyone who wants to come with us, now's the time." A few researchers joined Sullivan, their faces filled with fear and uncertainty. They moved towards the exit, leaving the rest of the team behind. Adrian watched them go, a heavy feeling settling in his chest. They couldn't afford this division, not now. "Let's move," he said to the remaining team. "We have work to do." They carried the vials of the compound to the breached section, working quickly to apply it to the advancing ice. The red ice recoiled, its dark crimson turning to gray, but the process was slow, and the ice was relentless. "We need more compound," Dr. Hayes said, her voice strained. "It's working, but we need to cover more ground." Adrian nodded, directing the team to prepare more of the substance. The battle against the ice was fierce, every second feeling like an eternity. As they fought, the sounds of the other group preparing to leave echoed through the corridors. Adrian tried to push the thoughts of their mutiny aside, focusing on the task at hand. Minutes felt like hours as they continued to deploy the compound. The red ice was stubborn, but they were making progress, inch by inch. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from the direction of the exit. Adrian's heart sank. He knew what it meant before he even saw it. The red ice had cut off Sullivan and his group. They were trapped. "We need to help them," Dr. Hayes said, her voice urgent. Adrian looked at the advancing ice, then at the terrified faces of his team. They were spread thin, every hand needed to keep the compound deployment going. But they couldn't just leave them. "Daniels, take a team and get them out of there," Adrian said. "We'll hold the line here." Major Daniels nodded, grabbing a few volunteers and heading towards the trapped group. The sounds of the struggle grew louder, the red ice refusing to relent. Adrian and Hayes continued their work, applying the compound with renewed urgency. The ice was fighting back, but so were they. Minutes later, Daniels returned, his face grim. They had managed to save most of Sullivan's group, but not everyone had made it. Adrian felt the weight of the loss, but he couldn't let it slow him down. They had to keep going. "Let's finish this," he said, his voice filled with determination. Together, they continued to push back the red ice, the compound slowly turning the tide. It was a hard-fought battle, but they were making progress. As the last of the red ice receded, Adrian allowed himself a moment of relief. They had done it. They had stopped the advance, at least for now. The team regrouped, exhausted but hopeful. The mutiny had shaken them, but they had come together in the end. Adrian looked at the faces of his team, seeing the resolve in their eyes. They had faced the ice and won a small victory, but the fight was far from over. "We did it," Dr. Hayes said, her voice filled with a mix of exhaustion and triumph. Adrian nodded. "We did. but we need to stay vigilant. The red ice isn't done with us yet. As they settled in for a brief moment of rest, Adrian knew they had taken a significant step forward. The outpost was still standing, and so were they. But the battle against the red ice was far from over, and Adrian was ready to face whatever came next. They had hope, and that was enough to keep them fighting. The next few days were a blur of constant vigilance and relentless effort. The team had managed to push back the red ice, but the threat still lingered, and everyone knew it. They had to stay on guard, ready for any sign of a new breach. Adrian was in the control room, reviewing the latest data. The compound was effective, but they needed more of it, and quickly. Dr. Hayes was beside him, her eyes glued to the monitors. "We're stabilizing, but we need to find a long-term solution," Adrian said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. Hayes nodded. "We're working on it, but there's something else you need to see." She pulled up a series of video feeds from different parts of the outpost. At first glance, everything seemed normal, but then Adrian saw its shadows moving in the periphery, shapes that shouldn't be there. "What is that?" Adrian asked, his heart rate quickening. Hayes zoomed in on one of the feeds. "I don't know. We've been seeing these shadows since the last big breach. It's like the ice is manifesting something." Adrian stared at the screen, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The shadows moved with a purpose, almost as if they were alive. "Is it the ice?" he wondered aloud. "Is it creating these entities?" Before Hayes could respond, the alarm blared again. Another breach. Adrian's stomach dropped. They couldn't afford this right now. "Let's move," he said, grabbing his gear. "We need to contain this." They rushed to the affected area, the team following close behind. As they approached, the temperature dropped noticeably, a chill seeping into their bones. The red ice was there, but this time it was different. It seemed to be pulsating. "Look," Hayes whispered, pointing. From the center of the ice, a shape began to form. It was humanoid, but twisted and grotesque, its body made of the same crimson substance. It moved slowly, deliberately, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. "It's an entity," Adrian said, his voice barely a whisper. "The ice is creating living entities." The team stared in horror as the entity took a step forward. They had faced the ice, but this was something new, something far more dangerous. "We need to destroy it," Major Daniel said, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. "Now." Adrian nodded. "Use the compound. It worked on the ice, it should work on this thing." They moved quickly, applying the compound to the advancing entity. At first, it seemed to have no effect. The entity continued to move forward, its eyes locked on Adrian. But then slowly the compound began to work. The entity's movements became sluggish, its form starting to dissolve. It let out a horrible, guttural noise, a sound that chilled Adrian to his core. "Keep applying it," Hayes urged. "We're almost there." With a final agonized scream, the entity disintegrated, the red ice that formed it turning to a dull gray. The team let out a collective breath, the tension in the air finally easing. "What was that?" one of the researchers asked, his voice shaking. Adrian shook his head. "I don't know, but it was connected to the ice. We need to find out more." Back in the control room, the team reviewed the footage again. The entity was gone, but the implications were clear. The red ice was evolving, creating living manifestations of itself. This changed everything. "We need to understand this," Adrian said, his mind racing. "If the ice can create entities, it's more dangerous than we thought. We need to find its source, and we need to do it fast." Hayes nodded, her face set with determination. Agreed. We need to figure out how it's doing this and stop it at the source. The team set to work, their focus sharper than ever. They analyzed the data, looking for any clues about the origins of the red ice and the entities it created. The symbols, the ancient texts, it all pointed to something much bigger than they had imagined. As the hours passed, Adrian felt a growing sense of urgency. They were on the brink of something huge, something that could change the course of their battle against the red ice. Late that night, as Adrian pored over the ancient texts, he found a passage that made his blood run cold. It spoke of an ancient force, a malevolent entity that could control and manipulate matter. The symbols matched those they had found in the cave. "This is it," Adrian said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The ice isn't just a substance. It's a manifestation of something ancient, something sentient." Hayes looked up, her eyes wide. "You mean the ice is alive?" Adrian nodded. "In a way, yes, it's being controlled by this entity. And if we're going to stop it, we need to find a way to sever that connection." They had a new goal now, a new focus. The battle against the red ice had taken on a whole new dimension, but Adrian felt a renewed sense of purpose. They had faced the entity and survived. Now they had to find a way to defeat it. As the team worked late into the night, the sense of dread was tempered by determination. They had a chance, a real chance, to end this once and for all. And Adrian knew they wouldn't stop until they did. The discovery that the red ice was controlled by an ancient, malevolent entity galvanized the team. They worked tirelessly, racing against time to find a way to sever the connection and stop the ice once and for all. Adrian stood in the central hub, surrounded by his team. The room buzzed with a mix of tension and determination. Dr. Hayes was hunched over a table filled with ancient texts and modern equipment, trying to decipher the final pieces of the puzzle. "We need to find the entity's core," Adrian said, his voice steady. "If we can destroy that, we might be able to stop the ice." Major Daniels nodded. "Our best bet is the cave where the ice was first discovered. It's risky, but it's the only lead we have." Adrian agreed. "We'll need a small team to go in and find the core. The rest will stay here to hold the outpost." As they prepared for the mission, the weight of what they were about to do settled over them. This was their last chance. If they failed, the red ice would consume everything. The team gathered their gear and headed out into the icy wasteland. The journey to the cave was treacherous, the cold biting through their suits, but they pressed on, driven by the knowledge that their survival depended on this mission. When they reached the cave, Adrian felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. The symbols on the walls seemed to pulse with a dark energy, and the air was thick with an oppressive presence. "We need to find the core," Adrian said, his voice echoing in the cavern. "Stay alert." They moved deeper into the cave, the narrow passages opening up into a large chamber. In the center, a dark mass pulsed with a sinister red glow. It was the heart of the entity, the source of the red ice. "There it is," Hayes whispered. "The core." Adrian nodded. "We need to destroy it. Set the charges around it. We have to be quick." As they set the explosives, the ground began to tremble. The entity sensed their presence, and the red ice started to spread more rapidly, tendrils reaching out towards them. "We're running out of time," Daniels said, his voice tight with urgency. Adrian finished setting the last charge and looked at his team. "We need to get out of here, now." They turned to leave, but the ice was moving too fast. It blocked their path, cutting them off from the exit. The only way to stop it was to detonate the charges manually. "We can't all make it out," Adrian said, realizing what needed to be done. "Someone has to stay behind and set off the charges." The team fell silent, the reality of the situation sinking in. Hayes stepped forward, determination in her eyes. "I'll do it. You need to get back and make sure the outpost is safe." Adrian felt a surge of emotion. "No, Emily, we need you. I'll stay." Hayes shook her head. "You're the leader. They need you more. I can do this." Before Adrian could protest, Hayes took the detonator and started towards the core. "Go," she said, her voice firm. "I'll make sure this ends here." With a heavy heart, Adrian nodded. "Thank you, Emily. We won't forget this." The team retreated, fighting their way through the advancing ice. As they reached the entrance of the cave, they heard the explosion behind them. The ground shook, and a blast of heat and light erupted from the cave, illuminating the dark sky. Adrian looked back, a mix of sorrow and resolve in his eyes. She did it. The core is destroyed. They made their way back to the outpost, the red ice slowly receding. The atmosphere was somber, but there was also a sense of relief. They had stopped the immediate threat, but the loss of Dr. Hayes weighed heavily on them all. Back at the outpost, the team regrouped, the air thick with a mix of grief and determination. They had lost one of their own, but her sacrifice had given them a chance to rebuild and recover. Adrian stood before his team, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Dr. Hayes gave her life to save us. We owe it to her to make sure her sacrifice wasn't in vain. We'll rebuild, and we'll make sure this never happens again." The team nodded, their resolve strengthened. They had faced the darkest depths and come out the other side. There was still much work to be done, but they had hope, and that was enough to keep them going. As the outpost began to recover, Adrian knew they would never forget the sacrifice made by Dr. Hayes. Her bravery had given them a future, and they would honor her memory by ensuring that future was bright. They had faced the entity and won, but the battle had left its mark. They were stronger for it, united by the bonds forged in the fire of their struggle. And together they would continue to fight, no matter what challenges lay ahead. The outpost was eerily quiet after the explosion in the cave. The red ice had receded significantly, but the team knew it wasn't completely over. They had dealt a significant blow to the entity, but its influence lingered. Adrian and the remaining team members prepared for their final stand. Adrian gathered everyone in the control room. "We've crippled the entity, but it's not dead. We need to finish this. We have to find any remaining pockets of red ice and destroy them." Major Daniels nodded. "We'll split into teams and sweep the entire facility. We need to be thorough." They armed themselves with the remaining vials of the compound and flamethrowers. Every team member was ready, their faces set with determination. This was at the final push to reclaim their outpost and their lives. Adrian led the first team, moving methodically through the corridors. The red ice was weaker now, retreating into dark corners and cracks in the walls. They applied the compound, watching as the ice dissolved and turned to gray ash. "Keep moving," Adrian urged. "We can't leave any trace of it." They moved room by room, clearing out any remnants of the ice. The sense of urgency was palpable, but so was the hope. They were winning, finally pushing back against the relentless force that had threatened to consume them all. In the main lab, they encountered a large pocket of red ice, pulsating weakly. Adrian directed his team to encircle it and apply the compound from all sides. The ice writhed and hissed, but it was no match for their combined effort. Within minutes, it was gone. "We're getting close," Dr. Hayes' voice crackled over the radio. "We've cleared most of the west wing. How's it looking on your end?" "We're making progress," Adrian replied. "We've taken out a large section in the lab. Keep at it." As they continued their sweep, the team found fewer and fewer pockets of ice. The entity's presence was weakening, its grip on the outpost loosening. But Adrian knew they couldn't let their guard down. They regrouped in the control room after several hours, exhaustion etched on every face. "We've cleared most of the outpost," Daniels reported. "Just a few minor areas left to check." Adrian nodded. "Good work, everyone. Let's finish this. The final areas were the storage rooms in the lower levels. They moved carefully, aware that any remaining ice could still pose a threat. In the last storage room, they found a small, concentrated mass of red ice, glowing faintly in the dim light. "This must be the last of it," Adrian said, stepping forward. "Let's end this." They surrounded the ice and applied the compound, watching as it bubbled and hissed, the red glow fading. The room grew warmer as the ice melted away, leaving only a puddle of inert gray sludge. "It's done," Hayes said, her voice filled with relief. "We've cleared it all." The team let out a collective breath, the tension finally easing. They had done it. The red ice was gone, and the entity's influence was broken. Back in the control room, Adrian addressed the team. "We did it. We fought back and won. Dr. Hayes' sacrifice wasn't in vain. We have our outpost back." The team nodded, their faces showing a mix of exhaustion and pride. They had faced the darkness and emerged victorious. It had cost them dearly, but they had prevailed. As they began the process of rebuilding and securing the outpost, Adrian took a moment to reflect. The battle had been long and hard, but they had found strength in each other. They had faced a seemingly unstoppable force and defeated it through determination and unity. "Thank you," Adrian said quietly, looking around at his team. "For everything. We couldn't have done this without each and every one of you." They spent the next few days reinforcing the outpost, ensuring that the red ice could never return. The atmosphere was still tense, but there was a sense of hope and renewal. They had faced the worst and come out the other side stronger. Adrian knew they would always carry the scars of this battle, but they had also gained something invaluable, a sense of purpose and resilience. They had proven that even in the face of unimaginable horror, they could fight back and win. As the days turned into weeks, the outpost began to return to some semblance of normalcy. The memories of the red ice and the entity lingered, but they no longer held the same power. The team had reclaimed their lives and their future. Adrian stood outside, looking at the horizon. The cold wind blew, but it felt different now. It was a reminder of the challenges they had overcome and the strength they had found within themselves. They had faced the final stand and emerged victorious. And for the first time in a long while, Adrian felt a sense of peace. They were ready for whatever came next. The outpost slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy in the weeks following their victory over the red ice. The team worked tirelessly to repair the damage, both to the facility and to their own spirits. Adrian watched over them, feeling a mixture of pride and sorrow. The central hub was bustling with activity. Equipment was being repaired, supplies restocked, and new safety protocols implemented. The threat of the red ice had passed, but the scars it left behind were still fresh. Adrian stood in the control room, looking out over the team. Dr. Hayes approached, her face lined with exhaustion but also a hint of satisfaction. "We've come a long way," she said, standing beside him. "We have," Adrian agreed. "Thanks to everyone's hard work and sacrifices." The memory of Dr. Emily Hayes' sacrifice was a heavy burden. Her courage had given them the chance to fight back, and her loss was a constant reminder of the cost of their victory. "We need to make sure something like this never happens again," Major Daniel said, joining them. "We've reinforced the containment protocols, but we also need to keep studying the red ice, understand it completely." Adrian nodded. "Agreed. We need to be prepared for anything. We can't let our guard down." As they continued their work, the atmosphere in the outpost began to shift. The fear and tension that had gripped them for so long were slowly replaced by a sense of determination and resilience. They had faced the unimaginable and come out the other side stronger. In the weeks that followed, the team focused on documenting everything they had learned about the red ice and the entity that controlled it. The data they gathered would be crucial for preventing any future incidents. Adrian spent his days coordinating the efforts, ensuring that every detail was recorded. He also made sure to check in on his team, offering support and encouragement. They had been through so much, and he wanted to make sure they were okay. One evening, as the sun set over the frozen landscape, Adrian gathered the team in the mess hall. It was a rare moment of relaxation, a chance to reflect on everything they had accomplished. "I want to thank all of you," Adrian said, raising a cup of coffee. "We faced an incredible challenge, and we overcame it together. We couldn't have done it without each and every one of you." The team raised their cups in a silent toast, the bond between them stronger than ever. They had become more than just colleagues, they were a family, forged in the crucible of their shared ordeal. Dr. Hayes looked around the room, her eyes filled with pride. "We've proven that we can handle anything. Whatever comes next, we'll face it together." As the days turned into weeks, the outpost continued to recover. The constant threat of the red ice was gone, but the lessons they had learned would stay with them forever. They had faced their darkest fears and emerged victorious, and that knowledge gave them a new sense of purpose. Adrian knew that their work was far from over. There were still many questions to be answered, many mysteries to be unraveled. But he also knew that they were ready for whatever came next. Standing outside the outpost one evening, Adrian looked up at the sky. The stars were bright, a reminder of the vastness of the universe and the challenges that lay ahead. But for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of peace. They had faced the red ice and won. They had lost friends and colleagues, but they had gained something invaluable, a sense of unity and strength that would carry them through whatever came next. As Adrian turned to go back inside, he knew that they were ready. The future was uncertain, but they had proven that they could face anything together. The outpost was more than just a facility, it was a testament to their resilience and determination. And as they looked to the future, they knew that they would continue to fight, no matter what challenges lay ahead. For now, they had peace. And that was enough.